All across the internet, thousands of lost souls are seeking the answer to one of life's greatest questions. Am I the arsehole? One of my friends sent me a Reddit post the other day from the subreddit that bears that very name and asked if any philosophy was relevant to it. And to his surprise, it was very much so. So I asked him to send me a bunch of these posts where people ask the internet if they are in the wrong so that we can see which philosophical and ethical problems they raise. My name is Joe Foley, and this is Unsolicited Advice. Okay, here we have a post from someone who's deleted their account, and it says, "Am I the arsehole for pointing out to my friends that they are not famous?" And it reads as follows. My friends are dating, and they're also actors who have had small roles on a few TV shows, like up to 2 lines. Neither of them has a following in real life or on social media. They've got under 1,500 followers combined. Anyway, last week I posted a group picture on Instagram of people celebrating a friend's birthday. Everyone in the photo has their arms around each other's shoulders. Very platonic. Anyway, yesterday in a group chat among the 3 of us, they asked me to take the photo down because they don't want the public to know they are dating. I would consider taking it down if they looked bad or sloppy, but they don't. Also, everyone has their arms around each other, not just them. Anyway, I asked what they meant, and they said they didn't want to end up in gossip racks. I pointed out that they are not famous and that they don't even have functioning IMDb pages. They were livid and called me a bunch of names. I think they're delusional, but they've been texting me demanding I remove it and even sent me screenshots of them reporting it. Nothing has happened. At this point, I don't even want to be their friend. However, and probably because I'm an arsehole, I don't want to delete it, based solely on principle. So, the kind of moral reasoning in the comments here is that people tend to be arguing that even though these couple of people are acting a bit strange, they nonetheless ought to delete the photo because the other person has a right to control their own image. And this ties into something that was a pretty major theme in a book that I was reading earlier this year. It actually made it onto my, by the time I post this, it will be next year. So a book I was reading all the way back in pretend 2025, even though I'm recording this still in 2025. And that book was Lowry Presley's The Right to Oblivion. It actually made it onto my Books of the Year list. And at the beginning of that book, actually, it's just here. It's on my desk, so I can show you it right now. In this book, at the beginning of this book, he talks about a court case where an artist had used a sort of very, very ultra high-tech camera to shoot photos through people's windows in New York. Because, you've got these big high-rise buildings and with clear windows, big windows. And this artist had used a very, very cool technologically advanced camera to take photos of them while they're going about their daily routine. And they didn't take anything embarrassing. But it seemed that when people heard about this case, most of them had quite a visceral negative reaction to it. They had the sense that these people had had their right to privacy violated. And in fact, when they went to court over this, the judge said there wasn't a law that he could use in order to prevent these photos from existing or being used in an art exhibit, which is where they eventually ended up, or anything like that. But nonetheless, he thought there ought to be a law because he considered that this in some way violates something that really ought to be inviolable, legally speaking. And I find that really, really interesting. And I think it does. I think that people in this comment section are sort of getting at quite a similar-ish thing. They're basically saying, yeah, okay, you don't have a legal obligation to delete these photos, but there's something about the human wish to control our own image that seems to be viewed as governing, at least in the commenters under this post. And I think that a lot of people's intuitions point in this direction. I find that generally fascinating because it's one of those moral intuitions that's quite hard to square with our general legal framework that enables people like photographers to maintain copyright over the things that they take, over, the photos that they have taken, regardless of what they're of. I don't know. I find this a very, very interesting point. I don't know what law I would make. I like the idea of having increased privacy protections. And in fact, that's something that I very much had reinforced by Presley's book. One of Presley's main arguments in The Right to Oblivion, is that our right to privacy ought to really be valued much more highly among us, right? Because for him, we are underestimating the significance of privacy in a huge range of areas of our lives. In fact, by the end of the book, Presley's actually arguing that a high degree of privacy is needed in order to maintain a sense that life is rich and deep. It's a very interesting book, and I highly recommend it. So that seems to be the reasoning that most people are taking there. I'm quite sympathetic to that reasoning. And I suppose that the countervailing consideration would be something like this. Are we going to enforce a moral norm on anyone that takes any photo anywhere to not share that photo around or release it or anything if there is just someone else featuring in the photo in a minor way? So that, I suppose, would be the countervailing concern. Like I said, I'm a big fan of privacy protection, so on the whole, I'm sympathetic to the moral intuitions of the commenters that this person not necessarily ought to in some kind of heavyweight ought sense, but they would be the arsehole if they didn't take that down. I think that that's a good general agreement to have, even if it's quite difficult to enshrine in law. You know, one of the nice things about social censure as a kind of societal tool is that it's something that falls short of imprisonment or fines or heavyweight legal recompense, but is also nonetheless an enforcement mechanism, right? That's hopefully the kind of gap that it fills. It's there to enforce norms that fall short of being important enough to be enshrined in law, or alternatively, just aren't the kind of things that you can enshrine in law. So something you might want social censure to do is regulate romantic contact that isn't illegal, but nonetheless is like bad form. That's kind of the bad form is a good term for this, I think. So, for example, leading someone on. If you tried to create a law against leading someone on, or sleeping with someone and then dropping off the face of the earth, that'd be very hard to do, right? You'd need to pin it down in precise legal language in a way that didn't rely so much on people's contextual judgments. That's just difficult in areas as complex as social and romantic relationships. So social censure is sort of there to, in some ways, pick up the slack. But if you want to take an outside look on your own actions, then you'll wish that you had some well-trained critical thinking skills. And that's why you should check out today's sponsor, Brilliant. We all know that studying STEM subjects like maths, science, and programming can be incredibly hard. These can get unintuitive very early on, which often presents real challenges for students. But this is where Brilliant comes into play. Brilliant has added a huge number of topics this year, so you can learn anything from programming with functions to probability theory to learning the ins and outs of large language models or classical mechanics. Additionally, Brilliant's learning is based around completing exercises, so you can learn by putting the ideas that you're picking up into practice directly, which both improves retention and just keeps things interesting. Brilliant also personalizes your learning, making sure that you improve at a steady and reliable pace. If you want to improve your own critical thinking skills, then you should check out the logic courses on Brilliant, which will just let you see what logic is all about. And with even a little bit of logic, the world is a whole lot clearer. To learn for free on Brilliant for a full 30 days, go to brilliant.org/unsolicited advice or scan the QR code on screen, or you can click the link in the description. Brilliant's also giving my viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, so please do check that out. But anyway, back to the video. I'm not sure how I feel about there being a law about whether you can own your own image. I think there are certain limits on your image's use that I think we could plausibly enshrine in law. So something that I've been thinking a fair amount about are things like AI deepfakes. I was reading an article about this the other day about sort of explicit photos of them made that aren't of them, but it uses their image uses AI to undress them. Anyway, it sounds all pretty awful to me. And that seems like the kind of thing where actually, firm legal protection seems pretty necessary. And whether you ground that into a kind of totalizing right to control your own image is, I suppose, its own question. Because again, like if I photographed a politician in the act of receiving a bribe, well, we don't want that politician to be able to say something like, okay, you can't use that photo because I have the right to my own image. So yeah, in terms of legal protections, I think it will very, very clearly have to be very carefully done. But as I say, I think there are clear cases where it's worth having legal protections there, and there are clear cases where it seems like we want to protect the right of someone who has captured something illicit, in the case of the politician being bribed, to then share that information because it might be in the public interest. So I don't know how you'd actually codify a norm here or codify law here. I think could be an incredibly complicated question. Nonetheless, I do think it's a question that needs to be answered in the legal sense. But I think this would probably be a case where we want social censure to pick up the slack. The other thing that I found really interesting about this story, the idea of somebody using a sort of faux fame or even real fame as a method or appealing to that for some kind of special treatment. Like in this case, requesting the photos down because they perceive themselves as sort of a very, very important person. That, a lot of people have pointed out, and I broadly agree, that seems like a socially condemnable thing. Even if we don't consider it, capital I immoral, it seems like a dick move. That's another one of those, like the term not good form, a dick move, I think is pretty good at capturing this interim set of behaviors between what most people would consider outright immorality and just straightforward moral or morally permissible behavior. It's like permissible but worthy of condemnation or something like that. Yeah, a dick move. So people perceive that kind of thing as a dick move. And I find that really interesting because when I was thinking about why, I came to the conclusion that it might be to do with the same reasoning by which we consider things like discrimination on the basis of racial or, sexual characteristics wrong, because we tend to consider that these things are irrelevant to the judgments being made. So, why is it wrong to discriminate racially when you're hiring someone outside of very, very specific situations? Well, it's because that's not a relevant characteristic for the job that's being performed, Similar for things like age discrimination. Like, why is it illegal and frowned upon to discriminate against someone on the basis that they are old or alternatively young? Well, we tend to think because in most scenarios that is irrelevant to the performance of the job at hand. It's due to its irrelevance in its assessment that it becomes an illegitimate way of judging someone, right? That's part of the underlying factual basis for why we then make the further evaluative judgment that these things are impermissible. And there are these rare exceptions where we do consider these characteristics relevant to the performance of a task. So say you're managing a construction site and a 75-year-old comes in looking for a job, well, then you can plausibly say, look, man, you're probably gonna not be quite up to this task. And it's not anything to do with age per se, but rather we become less physically capable as we get older. And I think that when people ask for special treatment because of fame or micro fame or quasi fame, as these people seem to have, I think that we're doing a similar thing. We're sort of unfairly discriminating in favor of ourselves based on a characteristic that most people, I think quite rightly, would consider irrelevant. So say I've got YouTube subscribers, right? So say, and this is something that I've heard that some people do, and I find it really quite I don't know, abhorrent seems like too strong of a term. I find it kind of off-putting, grim, maybe that's the right kind of mixture of disgust and aversion that I feel towards it, where people will say things like, give me this free meal and I'll post you on my photo or on my profile or something like that. Not that I can really do that with YouTube anyway, but people do this with Instagram and stuff if they're kind of Insta famous. And that's fine if that's a prior arrangement, right? I think that when people act entitled to that, one of the reasons that ticks people off is because it's taking a morally and or evaluatively irrelevant characteristic like fame and using it to argue for special treatment of yourself. So that's the second thing I find quite interesting about this case, in that I think that there is a plausible philosophical starting point for evaluating why we are so averse to this thing that people do where they demand special treatment because of their fame, right? Like when you hear a story of a celebrity, somebody genuinely very famous, unlike the people in this Reddit post, who, go to restaurants and demand special treatment or demand free stuff or demand hotel rooms at discounted prices or whatever, we feel an aversion to that, I think, because we are judging it as unfairly discriminating in favor of yourself using characteristics that aren't relevant to the situation at hand. Right, here we have a post by ScaredFold126, and it reads, "Am I the asshole for telling my friend that he was getting cheated on? I, 29 male, told my close friend and co-worker, 28 male, that his soon-to-be wife, 28 female, had been cheating on him for the majority of their relationship. I'll call them Chris and Maria. I found out when me and my girlfriend were out shopping for Christmas. We were checking our stuff out when she noticed that we forgot to get milk, and we use milk almost daily, so I took the cart and ran back to the opposite side of the store to get a few jugs of it. On my way there, I saw Maria with another one of our co-workers, Matt, in the personal hygiene aisle, which is right next to the fridges where the milk is. As I got the milk features so heavily in the story, I love that, and a tub of strawberry ice cream my girlfriend asked me to get, I accidentally listened to their conversation. I didn't mean to, but they were laughing really loud at a self-pleasuring toy that they left on the bottom rack near the children's toothbrushes, and I'm a nosy fuck sometimes. Matt kept talking about how he would like to use it on Maria, and she wasn't shy about saying yes to the idea. At this point, I was annoyed at her. A year ago, when Matt and Maria really got closer, she introduced Matt to both me and Chris as her brother-like friend, so Chris didn't care if they were ever alone together or for how long. At this point, Matt had seen me. I just put my earphones in and pretended that I couldn't hear them even though my music was very low. The second me and my girlfriend got in the car, I told her about what I saw. After we put all the groceries away, she scrolled through both Matt and Maria's Instagram accounts for a while. We decided to call Chris over to our place for dinner and TV. The four of us usually have dinner and watch a bunch of game shows bi-weekly, but we called him in for an extra night and left out his fiancée this time. After the dinner, a few drinks that Chris had, and a few episodes from the game show channel, Chris was about to get up to leave when my girlfriend showed him a picture she found on Matt's sister's Instagram page, where in the background Matt and Maria were very visibly making out. She told him that she found out that Maria was cheating on him, and I told him a slightly sped-up version of how I found out, presumably without so much detail about the milk. He didn't believe it one bit until he searched up Matt's sister's page and found the pictures himself. He found it even worse than my girlfriend did because he scrolled down a little and saw that she captioned one of the pictures saying, "Matt and Maria's 5-year anniversary is today," with a bunch of pictures of them through the years. Chris and Maria had been together for 6 years. He believed us then, but he started yelling at us and getting really angry at us for telling him about it. He said that he would have been fine staying in his blissful ignorance and that he wouldn't have to overthink their entire relationship if we didn't tell him. I brought up the fact that if he found out during their marriage, then it would cost him a lot more than it would now, and that it should be good for him to find out earlier rather than later. He just responded saying that if it wasn't for us, he would have never found out because if Maria and Matt were already this good at hiding it, then it would always stay that way. My girlfriend said that maybe Maria would have ended up leaving Chris for Matt mid-marriage, and Chris just got in his car and drove home. I really feel like an asshole for telling him, but I felt that it was better for him to know than for me to help hide it. You can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Am I in the wrong here? And people have generally said that he's not in the wrong. I think that very few people would ultimately say this person has done something really condemnable here, but I do think that the reasoning between his friend, Chris, and him about whether harm has been done to Chris by telling him about his girlfriend's infidelity is really interesting. Because at one level, let's take everything that Chris says as read, and let's say that he really would have been happier had he not been told about this infidelity. Well, then this is a classic form of a moral dilemma whereby you are confronted with lying to increase the sort of net pleasure in the world, or telling the truth and doing someone harm. So the most sort of famous example of this is the axe murderer dilemma, where somebody's at your door and they're asking whether your friend is in, and they're brandishing an axe and they say they want to kill your friend, and you are confronted with whether you lie to them or tell them the truth. And this is often caricatured to like lampoon Kant's philosophy, as I went over in my ethical dilemma tier list. But this situation, I think, is a plausible conflict between the utilitarian perspective, again, taking everything that Chris says about how he would be happier not knowing and it wouldn't come back to haunt him further down the line as read, which I think most people would say is false. But nonetheless, let's take him at his word. In which case, this is a toss-up between Chris's overall happiness and Chris knowing the truth, and whether it is right for the author of this Reddit post to lie to Chris in order to preserve his happiness. It is a conflict between the value of honesty, or your duty to tell the truth, if you want to put this in deontological terms, and the consequences of that. So the pleasure or pain or thwarted desires or achieved desires of the people affected by your decision over what to say. And that is a classic case of two different moral systems just clashing against one another, which is really interesting. And it's lovely to see it in the wild. You know, we may think that deontology versus consequentialist ethics is sort of a classroom thing. But no, here is an example of somebody attempting to argue against someone else's desire and felt duty to tell the truth on the grounds that it will harm them consequentially, or that it has harmed them consequentially. But another incredibly interesting philosophical debate that this Reddit post opens is what it means to be harmed. So Chris's assessment of his own situation here is that it is the knowledge of the infidelity that is causing him harm, and that if he had remained ignorant of that infidelity, then no harm would have been caused to him. That's relying on an underlying assumption that we call an internalist theory of harm, or an internalist theory of well-being. It's kind of the flip side. Sometimes it's called an internalist theory of welfare. People have different words for it, but the underlying idea is that if you are an internalist about harm, you think that harm is ultimately cashed out in how someone feels about a given situation, right? So someone is harmed based on the negative internal states that they feel. That might be pain. That might be a thwarted desire. That might be just disliking the situation, like a judgment of dislike, separate from any kind of emotion about it, if you can sort of conceive of such a thing. That is the kind of thing that for an internalist about welfare or well-being or harm, that's what makes something harmful. For an externalist, there are goods that you can be deprived of that, regardless of how you feel about them, do in fact harm you. So perhaps a good way to illustrate the difference here is by appealing to another ethical dilemma that I mentioned in my tier list video, which is the experience machine. This is a thought experiment by Robert Nozick, and it asks you whether you would, if given the option, allow yourself to be plugged into a machine that simulates a perfect world for you. So none of it's real, and you won't know that because they'll wipe your memory, but none of it's real. But you will be in immense pleasure for the rest of your life. Would you take that deal? Nozick argues that most people wouldn't, and I do in fact think that when they've tested this out, most people wouldn't, especially when it is boiled down to something like, you won't have any conscious experiences apart from pleasure. You will just be sort of hopped up on like Soma from Brave New World or something like that. Then most people do decline it. And Nozick uses this in part to argue that people do not simply desire internal states of pleasure and wish fulfillment and things like that. They desire external goods in the world. And that is the thing that we should measure when we talk about whether someone is harmed or someone is benefited by something. And another good example of this, right, is that imagine that you lived in a society where there was just no freedom of expression at all. You couldn't say anything that wasn't in line with your party's wishes or whatever. However, as it so happens, you just don't tend to get the desire to speak recalcitrant ideas. You just don't think any recalcitrant thoughts. You're just, perfectly in line with what the law happens to decree as the only acceptable speech, even though it's only a tiny amount of speech. And, you bumble along perfectly happy in this state until you pass away one day. Quite a lot of people would argue that even if this person, this kind of perfectly obedient, totalitarian subject, even if they never experience displeasure at their state, they are nonetheless worse off for being in that state. So that's one way to bring it down to earth. One way maybe of bringing this out even more would be to say that if you were to encourage a recalcitrant thought in that person, and thus they were to experience the displeasure of suddenly feeling like they have no freedom of expression, in addition to actually having no freedom of expression, would you be the cause of their harm? Or would the deprivation of their freedom of expression be the cause of their harm? That might be another way of thinking about it. It's not perfect, but it kind of brings out the intuition, because for a lot of people, an internalist conception of harm just is the common sense position. But actually, I do think that there are reasonably decent philosophical reasons for at least considering the idea that there are harms that are external that nonetheless we should, pragmatically incorporate into our theory of harm, that kind of do useful work there. So that's another thing that's very, very live in this Reddit post, is that this person has perceived that they would not have undergone harm had they not discovered about the infidelity. That if they'd have remained ignorant until the day they died, then that would have been a good thing for them. Or at the very least, it wouldn't have been that they would be no better or worse off for the infidelity if they had never found out about it. It is the conjunction of the infidelity and their knowledge of the infidelity that creates the harm. Now, if you're an internalist about harm, then he's sort of right in that he wouldn't have undergone any harm if he had never found out. And it's only in the act of finding out and thus gaining access to these particular unpleasant states that he therefore undergoes harm, which is just incredibly interesting. It's another reason why we might want to reconsider being purely internalists about harm, because most people's gut reaction, at the very least, for what that's worth, when they're learning about a situation like this is to say that Chris had undergone harm via the infidelity, and regardless of whether or not he ever found out about it, harm would have been done. So I don't know. I think this is really interesting. And again, those are two significant philosophical debates and significant philosophical arguments that are raised by this quite believable and ordinary situation described in this Reddit post. Well, I mean, maybe not ordinary. I don't know how common it is, but at the very least, it's not like this isn't a far-fetched trolley problem-esque abstract thought experiment. This has probably happened to someone, whether or not this particular story is true or not. So yeah, don't let anyone tell you that philosophy is useless. It can clear up some conceptual territory here at the very least. If you want to help me make more videos like this, then please consider subscribing, either to the channel, or if you're feeling incredibly generous and want to gain access to exclusive content, including my slow-motion book-by-book bookshelf tour, then consider subscribing to the Patreon, though it's absolutely no pressure. The links are in the description. Okay, here we have a post from Panthrob, and it reads, "Am I the asshole for giving my partner an ultimatum over his eating habits? My partner and I are both 35-year-old men. We've been together for about 10 years, and we own a house and 2 dogs. My partner has always had acid reflux, and about a month ago had valve repair surgery for it. The recovery for it basically involves eating really bland foods and really small meals so that his stomach doesn't produce too much acid and doesn't get stretched too much by large meals. I do most of the cooking in the house, so I've been making the foods the doctor recommended. Things like plain rice, oatmeal, grilled chicken breast, green beans, bananas. Nothing too exciting and nothing too acidic. One day, while I was out, he ordered pizza in. He was so full and in so much pain afterwards that he ended up in hospital needing pain relief and a scan. The doctor reiterated that he needs to be really careful with what he eats. The week after, he did the same thing again and ended up in hospital. We had an argument afterwards that he needs to take his health seriously. I said that if he does this again and ends up in hospital, he can go by himself because I'm fed up of him not taking his own health seriously. He said that as his partner, I should always be there for him when he's not well. I said that I have been there for him, but if he keeps making the same mistakes, I don't want to keep having to sit in hospital with him for 6 hours at a time. Am I the asshole here? So most people on this have agreed that he's not the asshole, but I think the reasoning here is sort of interesting, because I think what we're seeing here in the clash between these two people is that we have two very, very dearly held norms in our evaluative landscape, for lack of a better term, that are fundamentally just in a tiny bit of tension and can sometimes be in pretty significant tension. So first, there's the idea that we owe other people certain things. We have duties towards others, minimal duties like don't harm them, things like that, don't go around hitting people, but also duties to maybe be polite or be courteous, or duties to care about other people or things like that. This probably comes across most easily in parental duties because, again, we enforce those by law. But even if we're not talking about legally enforceable duties, you tend to have bubbling away in the emotional background of your world a kind of sense that people ought to behave in certain ways towards friends. There are certain actions that they owe to friends and that friends owe to one another and that we owe to colleagues and, duties that we owe everyone in the world in some kind of minimal sense. Like, I don't know, the duty not to be actively hostile when you first meet them. If somebody was actively hostile to strangers all the time, we would probably condemn them in some way, even if we're not condemning them in a sort of capital M moral way. So that's one of our norms, right? And I'd say that's a pretty substantial norm. I very rarely see people eschew that norm totally because I just think it's very hard to get by without it in some way, shape or form. But the second norm, an equally dearly held norm, is the idea of bodily autonomy, right? We're pretty big on bodily autonomy in the modern world. That's a pretty big pillar of our evaluative landscape. The idea that you own your own body and can do with it what you wish. You can change it however you want. You can use it in whatever way you want, provided that you're not hurting anyone else. Your body is yours to do with as you see fit. However, we do also tend to make exceptions to this rule, right? So one of the things you can do in the UK, if somebody means themselves immediate harm and has the material capacity to do themselves physical harm, is you can secture them, which basically means that they're confined under the Mental Health Act to a medical institution until they're deemed not a threat to themselves or anyone else. That is a break in our norm of bodily autonomy, right? Because we're effectively saying, okay, yeah, you can do whatever you want with yourself and your body up to a point, but then we're taking away your autonomy and actually you can't do this to yourself, even if it doesn't harm anyone else, at least not directly, right? Because you're allowed to make choices with your own body that upset other people. Say you wanted to get a a tattoo and you knew that all of your family would hate the tattoo, well, we tend to say things like, you can get the tattoo if you like and they'll be upset and that's kind of their problem, right? I'm just talking about a kind of background moral assumptions, the kind of things that I hear people say regarding decision-making of that ilk. However, as I say, we do make exceptions in these extreme cases. And I think that there are people who've argued against making exceptions for those extreme cases, by the way. There was one of the biggest figures in the anti-psychiatry movement in the 20th century was a guy called Thomas Zaz. I think is how I pronounce his name. I think I've got that right as well. Who did argue against sectioning and basically said, look, if somebody means themselves a lot of harm, you just got to kind of deal with that, right? They're not hurting anyone else. I find that fascinating. And that is a very consistent position, right? But situations like these also bring this tension to the fore because here you've got a duty towards your partner to be sort of healthy or look after yourself, right? Because this is a person that cares about you and you've in some sense accepted their care. You've taken that care on board. You're planning a life together. You plausibly, or at least, and I would say plausibly, but you, in the view of most people, owe one another stuff and will be condemned if you don't provide that stuff. And one aspect of that stuff is looking after yourself, partly so your partner doesn't have to, but also partly because you recognize that you are cared about and have accepted that care, and that as a result, harm to you is also indirectly harm to your partner. You have accepted them in your sort of singularly autonomous space, at least concerning certain things. And yeah, so I think that this is an example of where these two norms butt up against one another, and in most people's view, the norm of duties to others wins out. And I think the reason I find this so fascinating, right, is because different people will have different lines they draw, right? So, for example, a big debate around relationship stuff online, and we might come onto this a little bit later, is the setting of boundaries. So where it is acceptable for someone to set boundaries and where it is acceptable for another person to accept those boundaries, right? We all recognize that there are limits to this, that someone's boundaries are condemnable in most people's eyes if they are unreasonable and impose unreasonable constraints on their partner. Say your boundaries for a new partner were that they had to transfer you all of their money and they could never do anything apart from what you told them to do, and they had no individual autonomy of their own. Well, we would tend to say that regardless of whether that person accepted that, that was an unreasonable boundary to set. However, that conversation about which boundaries are reasonable and unreasonable, what are the reasonable and unreasonable things that you can expect of your partner, are also just this conflict between bodily autonomy and duties that you hold to others. What are the duties you inherit by virtue of being someone's partner? And I think that this is a case where most people would say that this falls into your duty to look after yourself because not looking after yourself would do harm to your partner. But it doesn't strike me that there is an uncontroversial place to put this line. And I think that it is genuinely just two opposing factors that we keep in tension in our inherited moral view of the world. And I find that really interesting. So yeah, again, I suppose I would tend to fall more along the lines of owing duties here, but that's just sort of preference, really. I suppose I would say that because I hold kind of moral anti-realist sentiments. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. But I think this is a very interesting example of how these broader philosophical questions about which conflicting norms win out in certain situations does translate all the way down into everyday disputes between partners. So this is really kind of philosophy of the everyday stuff, which I find very exciting, and is yet another reason why Am I the Arsehole is such a good place to look at human moral disputes in practice being done unreflectively. The people aren't going in saying, right, here are my explicit moral considerations and here's what follows from them, as you might see in a philosophy journal. But nonetheless, people are making philosophical and moral arguments, even if they're not necessarily aware that that's what they're doing. I think that's both wonderful, because I love philosophy, and also just fascinating to see. Okay, next up we have a post called Am I the Arsehole for Taking Selfies with My Male Friend? And it reads like this. My, female 48, and husband, male 50, have been together for 24 years, married for 17 years, with 4 kids. We recently went out with friends of ours, 2 couples we've known for 15 years, and one of the lady's sister. All had a great night. Towards the end of the night, we were all taking a few photos. I took 2 selfies of me and the husband of my friend, also a friend. The next day, my husband has an issue with this because I didn't take any of him, and he says I'm the only one who does stuff like that. A few things like this have happened in the past, like once I put my head on the shoulder of a male friend when sitting beside him, and I've always felt I did nothing wrong, as I do in this situation. My gut feeling is this is not normal to be ridiculed for this, but am I the arsehole? And then edited. For context, the incident of putting my head on a friend's shoulder was a group of 5 couples after a night out waiting for a taxi. Everyone was there, including my friend's wife. A few drinks were had, and it was late, so I tilted my head sideways because I was tired, and he happened to be sitting next to me. If one of the women was sitting there, I would have done the same thing. There was no ulterior motive or cuddling or anything of the kind. We are all close friends, and his wife didn't have an issue. So, the interesting thing about this post in particular is that there's quite a lot of disagreement in the comments about exactly what's going on here and whether the people involved behaved inappropriately. So, the most liked comment or upvoted comment is, "You're the arsehole. How do other women feel about you taking pics with their husbands and putting your head on their shoulders? Please tell me you don't post these pics on social media." And then lots of people agree with that, right? So there's a sort of a consensus forming around that in this particular comment. But then the second most upvoted comment is, "Not the arsehole. It's okay to have friends of the opposite gender or even friends who aren't gendered. I hug my male friends, I take selfies, and I'm sure at some point in time I've leaned into some and put my head on their shoulder. If your partner is uncomfortable with you displaying affection with people of the opposite gender, he can express his discomfort and ask for you to be less so, but this guy sounds insecure and a tad controlling." So there are kind of 2 angles at which people are approaching this. And the interesting thing that I think this touches upon is not so much in the philosophy of morality or the philosophy of relationships or the philosophy of love. It's in the philosophy of language. So one of the great innovations of 20th century philosophy of language was the recognition of just how much linguistic understanding is contextually dependent. So now, if you were to talk to a cognitive linguist or someone working in pragmatics, which is the study of the use of language in practice, they would tell you that we fix an absolutely absurd amount of communicated meaning by appealing to contextual factors. And this makes a lot of sense, right? This isn't necessarily that unintuitive of a point. It's just that we often forget it in practice. So a very, very extreme example of this contextual importance in framing meaning is, say I were to shout, "I'm going to murder you." Well, in a lot of contexts, that would be really inappropriate, and that would also be interpreted as a threat. But if I am a character on stage as part of a play, well, then suddenly it's not a threat at all, and it might be a very appropriate thing to say within that particular linguistic context. And the filling in of meaning by context is sort of the same structure as the play example, but just to a much lesser and more subtle extent, if that makes sense. So what I think is accounting for the fact that some people have been very confident with "not the arsehole," and some people have been very confident with "yes, in fact, you are in the wrong," is because I think that these people are supplying different contextual factors to fill in the gaps of the description, because this description doesn't give us an awful lot. So the title just says, "Am I the arsehole for taking selfies with my male friend?" Which, devoid of context, you'd think, well, I mean, not necessarily. There's nothing inherently wrong with selfies. And then later in it, we've got a little bit more context. So you've got, "I took 2 selfies of me and the husband of my friend, also a friend, and the next day my husband has an issue with this because I didn't take any of him, and he says I'm the only one who does stuff like that." So here we have the husband appealing to contextual information, such as the fact that she was the only person taking selfies and this was the only person she was taking selfies with, to say that is communicated a slightly different content to how it would be if she had been taking selfies with everyone. And I don't know, that strikes me as really interesting because in effect, we aren't that good at coming up with general rules for how context affects meaning change. And that's kind of broadly, I think, quite a good thing, in that if we could come up with these ironclad rules for how context affects meaning, then I think that would show that language is a lot less flexible. Or rather, I think that if language was set up in order that we could do that, then language would have to necessarily be a lot less flexible. And I think that one of language's great tools is its seemingly endless flexibility to do huge swaths of stuff and purposes. And that's great. And that's one of the reasons why I love language. But in this case, it seems like there is a disagreement about what the meaning implications of this particular act is of taking the selfie, and also in the case of putting your head on a friend's shoulder, right? Because we can all imagine contexts wherein the meaning communicated would be one of deep attraction or something like that. Like, imagine that your partner, should you have one, was leaning against someone's shoulder and they were looking up at them and their eyes were full of adoration and they were smiling and you thought, God, it's been years since they've looked at me like this. Well, then I imagine that you would probably have quite an issue with it, even though that same act could be described as innocuously and innocently as I just tapped my head on a friend's shoulder, or I just temporarily leant my head on a friend's shoulder. So what I think's going on here, and to be fair, this is sort of a speculation on my part, is that these two people have filled in vastly different contextual factors for the circumstances around which these acts were committed, and thus they also have a very different idea of the implications of this particular piece of behavior, right? Because our behavior does have implications. We talk about implications in the context of language, and I've been using the philosophy of language to frame analyzing this particular Reddit post. But behavior also has implications. So most of us have an idea of what a disdainful look is and what that communicates to people, right? And I do think that the philosophy of language can also be helpfully used to analyze these seemingly non-linguistic phenomena, because a lot of philosophy of language, especially more modern philosophy of language and philosophy of language that leans towards pragmatics, so theorizing and studying and experimenting with language in use rather than semantic content in the kind of Frege, Dummett school, I suppose, of doing philosophy of language. Love those thinkers, by the way. But this kind of pragmatic side of philosophy of language, I think, is incredibly helpful at not just looking at linguistic communication, but also non-linguistic communication, even though in both cases, it's not like it can lay down rules of interpretation, though people have tried. And Paul Grice is one thinker who came up with maxims and rules of thumb for how implication works, so the unsaid content within a spoken statement. A paradigm example of this is, say I was writing you a reference for a university application, which I'm not qualified to do, but let's pretend that I was. If I were to say, oh, this candidate has excellent handwriting, and were to say nothing of your philosophical ability or academic acumen, that would imply that you didn't have those things because of the context in which I'm writing. So this is just one example of how philosophers have tried to get a handle on how context influences meaning, but as I said, there are no hard and fast rules. So my final point about this particular post is actually that I think this is a really good example of just how unhelpful soliciting advice on the internet can be, despite my channel name, which is that a lot of the time when people go to forums like Am I the Arsehole or relationships advice or stuff like that, they do not, and to a certain extent cannot, give the amount of information that is needed to make a relatively justified and sound judgment on what they should do in the situation they find themselves enmeshed in, because unless it is an absurdly simple and clear-cut case, like, I don't know, my husband has started a murdering puppies for fun club in our basement, to use the classic philosophical example of an abhorrent thing, people really struggle to get across the appropriate level of contextual information that one would need in order to really pass any kind of justified comment. And I find it really interesting that when I say that, and when I've mentioned this in the past, and when I talk to people about this, should the subject of online advice ever come up in conversation, people are normally pretty quick to recognize this. A lot of people agree. And yet, when people are just enmeshed in the context of an internet forum, all of a sudden, all of that goes out the window, and suddenly they feel like, yeah, no, I do have enough information to pass judgment here. And I think part of that is because we are, and by we, I also include me in this, we are pretty bad a lot of the time at recognizing what the things that we don't know exist are. And that kind of makes sense, right? Because we can't be aware of what they are, otherwise we would know about them. But there's an element of, Daniel Kahneman calls it, what you see is all there is, where we don't ask the question, what information don't I have access to? And in the case of online advice, especially relationships advice, because there's just so much context. I mean, the amount of context that you build up with someone over the course of a relationship, chances are we don't even know how to articulate that and put it all into words, even if we were given a whole day and 100,000 words to write it down. So, this person's been married for 17 years and been together for 24 years. There is an abundance of context to that cannot possibly be communicated. And I imagine that the reasonableness or lack thereof of either person's reaction in most of their conflicts is probably going to be tied up inexorably with that contextual framing. And I think that looking at this from a philosophy of language perspective helps us recognize that. Right, that's all we have time for today. If you want to check out more of these casual, unscripted style videos, I've got a playlist for you right here. Thank you so much for watching and have a wonderful day.